Marcus Reed adjusted the simple gray hoodie over his shoulders as he stepped into the bank's local branch, the sharp chill of the morning still lingering on his skin. He scanned the space. Neatly arranged desks, tellers busy with customers, and the faint hum of printers. It was an ordinary scene, but it carried a sense of significance for Marcus. This was one of the many branches under the corporate umbrella he now led, but he was here as an ordinary client today. Approaching the service desk, Marcus caught the sharp gaze of the manager, Carl Thompson. Mid-40s, a neatly trimmed beard, and an expression that oscillated between boredom and judgment. Carl's eyes flitted over Marcus's attire, sneakers, joggers, and a hoodie. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his posture stiffened slightly. "Can I help you?" Carl's tone was clipped cold. Marcus smiled politely. "Yes, I'd like to open a business account." Carl blinked. His eyebrows arched in disbelief before settling into a skeptical frown. He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the counter as if to clarify something. "A business account?" "Yes," Marcus replied, maintaining his composure. Carl glanced over Marcus again, this time with an overt smirk. "We have specific requirements for business accounts. Do you even have the necessary documentation?" Marcus, unfazed, pulled a folder from his bag and placed it on the counter. "Everything's here. My ID, tax information, and the incorporation paperwork." Carl hesitated, his confidence faltering for a brief moment. But it returned quickly. He didn't even open the folder. Instead, he leaned back and gave Marcus a dismissive look. "Look, Carl paused, clearly searching for the words. "This might not be the right bank for you. Our business accounts cater to more established professionals." Marcus's smile faltered, but only slightly. He sensed where this was going. "And what makes you think I'm not established?" Carl let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Well, I mean, no offense, but most of our clients don't show up dressed like they're about to hit the gym." A woman in the nearby line turned her head slightly, clearly overhearing the conversation. Marcus noticed, but didn't respond to her curious glance. Instead, he took a slow breath, measuring his response. "My clothing shouldn't matter if my documents are in order." His voice was calm, but firm. Carl's expression hardened. He stood up straight, adjusting his tie. "Listen, I don't have time for this. I'll ask you to leave if you're going to cause trouble." "Cause trouble?" Marcus repeated, his tone incredulous. Carl's voice grew louder. "Yes, trouble. I'm not here to argue. Either you leave, or I'll have security escort you out." By now, a few heads were turning toward the scene. Marcus felt the weight of their stares. The humiliation bubbled beneath his skin, but he refused to let it show. "You're refusing to open my account?" he asked, his voice steady. "I'm refusing to waste my time," Carl snapped. "Now, I'll give you one last chance to leave on your own, or—" "Mr. Thompson," a voice interrupted from behind. One of the tellers, a young woman with wide, concerned eyes, stepped forward. "Shouldn't we at least look at his paperwork?" Carl shot her a withering glare. "Maggie, I'll handle this. Get back to your desk." Marcus met the teller's gaze briefly, offering a subtle nod of thanks before turning his attention back to Carl. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone low but charged with meaning. Carl scoffed, waving him off like a pesky fly. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can just walk in and demand things without understanding how things work. This isn't some casual check-cashing service." The words stung, but Marcus refused to let Carl see it. Instead, he gathered his folder, sliding it back into his bag with deliberate care. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice calm but with an edge that made Carl pause. "This isn't a casual check-cashing service. It's supposed to be a professional institution, and yet here you are, making assumptions based on appearances." Carl's face flushed, but before he could respond, Marcus added, "Have a good day, Mr. Thompson. I'll see myself out." Marcus turned and walked toward the exit, the murmur of whispers following him. As he stepped into the brisk morning air, the weight of the encounter settled over him. He had faced prejudice before, countless times in fact, but this one hit differently. Not because of the insult, but because of the opportunity it presented. As he reached his car, Marcus leaned against the door for a moment, staring at the sleek vehicle that stood in stark contrast to his simple attire. He clenched his fists briefly, then released them, exhaling slowly. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The following morning, Marcus returned to the same bank branch, but this time, everything about him spoke of authority. His tailored navy suit fit him like a second skin, complemented by a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. A subtle but unmistakable air of confidence emanated from him as he strode into the building, flanked by Sarah Wilkes, his meticulous assistant, and Raymond Shaw, the regional director of operations. The buzz of the morning crowd filled the bank, but as Marcus entered, it was as if the air shifted. Employees paused mid-motion, their eyes catching the striking trio. Marcus walked past them without a word, his focus on the manager's desk. Carl Thompson looked up from his computer, his expression neutral at first, but it quickly morphed into surprise and nervous energy. He stood, forcing a smile, his eyes darting between Marcus and the suited professionals flanking him. "Good morning," Carl said, his voice laced with false cheer. "How can I help you?" Raymond spoke first, his tone clipped and professional. "We're here for a scheduled visit with the branch management. This is Marcus Reed." Carl's brows furrowed briefly, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Marcus Reed?" he repeated, the name on the edge of familiarity. Before Carl could connect the dots, Sarah added smoothly, "Mr. Reed is the CEO of the holding company that oversees this bank." Carl's face drained of color. His confident demeanor crumbled instantly, replaced by stammered words. "Oh, Mr. Reed, I wasn't expecting you. If I had known..." Marcus raised a hand, silencing him with a calm but commanding gesture. "It's fine. I didn't come here for fanfare." Carl nodded quickly, his nervous hands adjusting his tie. Of course. Please come to my office. We can discuss." "Here will do," Marcus interrupted, his tone even but firm. "No need for formalities." Carl's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The employees nearby tried to look busy, but it was clear they were eavesdropping. "I recognize you," Carl blurted suddenly, his eyes widening as realization struck. You came in yesterday." Marcus tilted his head slightly, a faint smile curving his lips. "Yes, I did." Carl's face reddened. He began stammering again. "I didn't realize. If I'd known who you were..." "That's the problem," Marcus cut in, his voice sharp enough to make Carl flinch. "You didn't know who I was, so you assumed. You judged me based on how I looked, how I dressed, and you decided I wasn't worth your time." Carl opened his mouth to defend himself, but Marcus continued, his voice calm but laced with steel. "You dismissed me, humiliated me, and tried to make me feel like I didn't belong in an institution I now oversee." Carl's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Mr. Reed, I assure you, that was never my intention." It doesn't matter what your intentions were," Marcus interjected. "What matters is what you did. And what you did was treat a potential client, someone seeking your help, with blatant disrespect." Raymond, standing to the side, folded his arms and shot Carl a disappointed look. "This isn't just about yesterday, Carl. We've had complaints about your behavior before. This incident only confirms the pattern." Carl's eyes widened. "Complaints?" "Yes, complaints," Sarah chimed in, her tone cool and businesslike. She pulled out a tablet and began scrolling. Dismissive attitude, lack of professionalism, poor customer service. And now, evidence of racial bias. No, Carl said, panic creeping into his voice. "This is all a misunderstanding. I've always treated clients fairly." Marcus raised a hand again, silencing him. "Stop," he said, his voice firm but not raised. "Carl, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to make a point." Carl stood frozen, his gaze darting between Marcus, Sarah, and Raymond. Marcus took a step closer, his presence towering. "People like you are why institutions like this lose trust in their communities. Your bias, whether conscious or not, drives people away. I built my career fighting for opportunities in spaces where people assumed I didn't belong. Yesterday, you reminded me how far we still have to go." The room was deathly silent. Even the faint hum of the printers seemed to pause. Carl's head dropped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed. Truly." Marcus regarded him for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his tone softer but no less firm. Apologies are meaningless without action. Carl, you're suspended effective immediately. You'll undergo mandatory training on diversity, inclusion, and customer relations before you can even consider returning to this branch. Carl looked up, his expression a mixture of shock and relief. Suspended? Not fired. Marcus's lips tightened into a thin line. If I fired you, it would be too easy for you to dismiss this as a one-time mistake. Suspension gives you time to reflect, to learn. But make no mistake, this is your one and only chance to do better. Carl nodded quickly, his hands trembling slightly. I understand. Thank you for giving me another chance, Mr. Reed. I won't waste it. Marcus nodded curtly, then turned to address the gathered employees. His voice carried authority, but also warmth. Let this be a lesson for all of us. Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect. It doesn't matter how they're dressed, where they come from, or what you think you know about them. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. There were murmurs of agreement, and a few employees nodded solemnly. Marcus turned back to Carl. This isn't just about you, Carl. This is about creating a culture where this kind of behavior is unacceptable. Do you understand? Yes, Mr. Reed, Carl said quickly. I do. With that, Marcus straightened his jacket and walked toward the exit. Sarah and Raymond followed closely behind. As the doors closed behind them, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't just about yesterday's insult. It was about making sure no one else had to experience what he had. And this was only the beginning. The tension within the bank branch lingered long after Marcus left, like a storm that had passed but still echoed in the air. Carl sat in his office, head in his hands, replaying every second of the encounter. His career, his reputation, everything was now hanging by a thread. For the first time in years, Carl felt vulnerable. But beneath the fear, there was something else: shame. Marcus, meanwhile, returned to his corporate headquarters. His schedule was packed, but his mind stayed fixed on the morning's events. He knew that Carl's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic, embedded in the culture of the industry. His mission now wasn't just to address Carl. It was to change the very fabric of the company he led. Later that afternoon, Marcus called a meeting with his leadership team. The room was large, with a polished oak table and panoramic views of the city skyline. Sarah sat beside him, her tablet ready, while the other executives shuffled into their seats. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped. What happened this morning wasn't just about one manager making a mistake. It's about how we, as an institution, have failed to address implicit bias within our ranks. A murmur rippled through the room. Raymond, seated a few chairs down, nodded. It's not the first complaint we've had about this issue, and it won't be the last, Marcus said firmly, unless we act now. He glanced at Sarah, who tapped her tablet and displayed a chart on the room's large screen. This is the current demographic breakdown of our management staff, Sarah explained. The chart showed a glaring lack of diversity at higher levels. It's clear that representation is an issue. Marcus's voice softened, but his words were no less impactful. I've been in Carl's shoes before, not as a manager, but as someone dismissed, undervalued, judged. It doesn't matter how far you climb. Prejudice has a way of finding you. The room fell silent. For many, this was the first time Marcus had spoken so openly about his experiences. I want actionable steps, Marcus continued. We're launching mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, starting at the top. And I mean everyone, including us. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. One, a senior VP named Linda, raised her hand. Marcus, I fully support this, but do you think mandatory training will be enough to change deep-seated behaviors? No, Marcus admitted. It won't. That's why we're also revisiting our hiring practices, promotion criteria, and internal reporting systems. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with accountability. As the meeting progressed, Marcus laid out his vision for a more inclusive workplace, one where stories like his, or Carl's, would become relics of the past. The next day, Carl sat in his small apartment, staring at the email from HR detailing his suspension and mandatory training. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a mirror reflecting his own failings. But as he stared at the screen, memories began to surface. Years ago, Carl had been in Marcus's position, though the circumstances were different. Fresh out of college, eager to prove himself, he had applied for a management trainee program at a prestigious bank. During the final interview, the panel, 3 older men, had exchanged skeptical glances as Carl presented his ideas. Interesting perspective, one of them had said, his tone dripping with condescension. But do you really think you're ready for this level of responsibility? Carl had left the interview feeling small, his confidence shattered. It took years to climb the ladder, and even then, the scars of those early experiences remained. But instead of confronting the pain, Carl had buried it, letting bitterness fester. The irony wasn't lost on him now. He had become the very thing he once despised, a gatekeeper, someone who judged others unfairly. Marcus, unaware of Carl's personal reckoning, continued his own journey. That evening, he sat in his home office, scrolling through old photos on his laptop. Pictures of his childhood in a cramped apartment, his first job as a janitor in a corporate building, his graduation ceremony. Each image was a testament to the obstacles he had overcome. One photo stopped him cold. It was a faded Polaroid of his mother, smiling as she held a homemade sign, "Dream Big." She had always been his biggest cheerleader, reminding him that his worth wasn't defined by others' perceptions. The memory fueled him. He opened a blank document on his computer and began drafting an internal memo to all employees. To the entire team, what defines us as individuals and as a company is how we treat others. Not just those who look like us, dress like us, or come from the same background, but everyone. True success isn't measured in profits or market shares. It's measured in the respect and trust we earn. We've fallen short of that standard, but together, we can do better. The memo went live the next morning, sparking conversations across the organization. Employees shared their own stories of bias, some as victims, others as witnesses. For Marcus, it was a humbling reminder of the scale of the challenge ahead. Carl, meanwhile, began his training. It was uncomfortable, forcing him to confront not only his biases, but also the pain he had carried for years. During one session, the facilitator asked each participant to share a moment when they felt marginalized. When it was Carl's turn, he hesitated but finally spoke. "Years ago, I was told I wasn't good enough for a job. Not because of my skills, but because of how I looked where I came from. It stuck with me, and somehow I let it turn me into someone who did the same to others." The room was silent, his confession hanging heavy in the air. By the end of the week, Marcus and Carl crossed paths once more, this time in the corporate office. Carl approached nervously, holding a folder. "Mr. Reed," he began, his voice subdued. Marcus turned, his expression unreadable. "Carl, I just wanted to say thank you," Carl said, his voice cracking slightly. "You could have fired me, and I wouldn't have blamed you. But instead, you gave me a chance to learn, to change. I won't waste it." Marcus studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Change isn't easy, Carl, but it's necessary. Don't let this be the end of your journey. Let it be the beginning." Carl nodded, clutching the folder tightly as Marcus walked away. For both men, the journey was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted. What mattered now was how they nurtured them. The days following Carl's suspension marked the beginning of a transformative wave within the company. Marcus had always believed in leading by example, and now his focus was on ensuring that the entire organization understood the depth of his mission. At the corporate office, the diversity training initiative rolled out company-wide, starting with senior management. The first session, mandatory for all executives, was a mix of tense silences and difficult conversations. Marcus, seated at the head of the conference room table, began the session by sharing his story. He described growing up in a community often overlooked by society, the sting of prejudice he faced as he navigated through life, and the encounter with Carl that reignited those wounds. "Bias," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "is like a poison in the air we breathe. Often invisible, but always toxic. And it doesn't just harm the people it's directed at, it weakens everyone. It undermines trust, erodes relationships, and chips away at the very foundation of an organization. One of the executives, a senior VP named Greg, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Marcus," he began hesitantly, "I think most of us here agree that diversity is important, but sometimes these initiatives can feel forced." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharpening. "Forced?" Greg cleared his throat. "I mean, we've always hired the most qualified people. Isn't that what matters most?" "That's the problem," Marcus replied evenly. "Who decides what qualified looks like? And how often does that definition exclude people who don't fit a certain mold? Talent doesn't have one face, one background, or one way of presenting itself. If we're not actively working to broaden our perspective, we're narrowing our potential." The room fell silent as Marcus's words sank in. Meanwhile, at the bank branch Carl had managed, changes were also underway. Maggie, the teller who had spoken up during Marcus's initial visit, was promoted to interim manager during Carl's suspension. It was an unexpected opportunity for her, but one she embraced with determination. Maggie took her new role seriously, starting with the staff. She organized team meetings, encouraging open discussions about their experiences and concerns. It wasn't easy. Some employees were hesitant to speak, while others were outright resistant. During one meeting, an older employee named Janet raised her hand. "Look, I've been working here for 20 years, she said, her tone defensive. "I've seen all kinds of people walk through those doors. It's not about bias. It's about knowing who's serious and who's wasting our time." Maggie frowned. "And how do you decide that, Janet? Is it based on their paperwork or on their appearance?" Janet opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, realizing the implication of her own words. "That's what we need to challenge," Maggie continued. "Our job isn't to judge, it's to serve. And if we're letting personal assumptions cloud that, we're failing." The conversation was uncomfortable but necessary. And as the days passed, a subtle shift began to take place within the team. Carl's journey through the mandatory training was equally uncomfortable. The sessions forced him to confront his own biases, and more painfully, the reasons behind them. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Carl found himself revisiting the moments in his career when he'd felt excluded. Memories he'd tried to bury surfaced with vivid clarity. The dismissive tone of an interviewer, the condescending smiles of colleagues who doubted him. For years, Carl had told himself that he'd overcome those challenges through sheer hard work and resilience. But now, he realized that instead of breaking the cycle, he perpetuated it. During a one-on-one session with the facilitator, Carl admitted, "I didn't even realize how much bitterness I was carrying. It was easier to project it onto others than to deal with it myself." The facilitator nodded. "That's often the case. But recognizing it is the first step. The real question is, what will you do with that recognition?" Carl didn't have an answer. Not yet. Back at the corporate office, Marcus's efforts began gaining traction. Employees at all levels were engaging in conversations they'd never had before. Stories of bias and exclusion were shared openly, creating a ripple effect of awareness and accountability. But not everyone was on board. Resistance came from certain pockets of the company, particularly among older employees who saw the changes as unnecessary or disruptive. One afternoon, Marcus received an anonymous email from a disgruntled employee. The message was brief, but pointed. "Not everyone wants to be part of your woke agenda. Some of us just want to do our jobs without being lectured." Marcus read the email twice before forwarding it to Sarah. "This is exactly why we're doing this," he told her. "Change doesn't come without resistance. The important thing is that we stay the course." Sarah nodded. "I'll draft a response for the broader team, reinforcing the importance of these initiatives." "No," Marcus said, shaking his head. "I'll write it myself." As the weeks passed, Carl completed his training and was invited to a follow-up meeting with Marcus. It was a moment Carl had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Seated across from Marcus in the CEO's expansive office, Carl felt the weight of his actions more acutely than ever. "Carl," Marcus began, his tone measured, "I've read the reports from your training sessions. It seems like you've made progress." Carl nodded. "I have, but I also know that progress doesn't erase the harm I've caused." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Carl. What do you think comes next? I think, Carl said slowly, that I need to earn back the trust one lost. Not just yours, but my team's and the clients'. And that's going to take more than words. It's going to take actions. Marcus's expression softened slightly. That's a good start. But remember, this isn't just about you. It's about creating a culture where no one else has to go through what you or I have experienced. Carl nodded, his resolve hardening. I understand, and I'm ready to do the work. Marcus extended a hand, and Carl shook it, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. As Carl prepared to return to his branch, Marcus reflected on the journey so far. The work was far from over, but the seeds of change were beginning to sprout. For Marcus, the ultimate measure of success wasn't just in policies or training programs. It was in the stories that would emerge years later of employees and clients who felt seen, valued, and respected. And while the road ahead was long, Marcus knew one thing for certain. They were moving in the right direction. Weeks turned into months, and the changes Marcus initiated began to take root across the organization. The company wasn't just implementing a new policy, it was transforming its culture. For Marcus, this was the culmination of everything he had worked for, creating spaces where everyone, regardless of their background, could thrive. Carl returned to his branch with a renewed sense of purpose. His suspension had been a humbling experience, but it also became a turning point. The staff, initially wary of his return, watched closely as Carl began to rebuild his relationships. One morning, Maggie, now officially promoted to assistant manager, approached Carl during a quiet moment. "Morning, Carl," she began, her tone measured. "How's it going?" Carl looked up from his desk and offered a tentative smile. "Better, I think. Still have a long way to go." Maggie nodded. "You do, but I'll say this. You're trying, and that matters." Carl exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thanks, Maggie. That means a lot coming from you." Over the weeks, Carl made a point to listen more and speak less. He encouraged team meetings where everyone's voice was heard, and he took the lead in implementing the diversity initiatives Marcus had introduced. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere at the branch began to shift. At the corporate level, Marcus's vision for inclusivity continued to expand. The company launched scholarships for underrepresented students pursuing careers in finance and established mentorship programs to nurture talent from diverse backgrounds. During an annual company-wide meeting, Marcus stood on stage, addressing hundreds of employees and thousands more watching via live stream. "When I walked into that branch months ago, I didn't expect my visit to spark a movement," he began. "But what happened there reminded me that change doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It starts when we choose to act." He paused, scanning the room. "Each of you has the power to make someone feel seen, valued, and respected, or dismissed, excluded, and forgotten. The choice is yours, and it's a choice we must make every single day." The audience erupted into applause, the energy palpable. Carl, watching the live stream from his branch, felt a lump in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for the future of the organization. Months later, Marcus made an unannounced visit to the branch again. This time, he walked in not as a client in casual attire, but as himself, the CEO. Maggie greeted him at the door, her professionalism underscored by a warm smile. "Mr. Reed," she said, "it's great to see you again." Marcus nodded. "Likewise, Maggie. How's everything here?" "Better," she said sincerely. "We've come a long way." As Marcus made his way through the branch, he noticed the changes immediately. The staff seemed more engaged, the environment more welcoming. When he reached Carl's desk, the manager stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Reed," Carl said, his voice steady but respectful. "Thank you for coming." Marcus shook his hand firmly. "Carl, it's good to see you." They sat down for a brief conversation, during which Carl shared the progress he and his team had made. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges, but emphasized the strides they'd taken to foster a more inclusive environment. Marcus listened intently, then smiled. "I'm glad to hear it, Carl. Keep up the good work." As Marcus prepared to leave, Carl called after him. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "I want you to know, I'll never forget the second chance you gave me. And I'll make sure no one else here forgets it either." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "It's not just about second chances, Carl. It's about what you do with them. Keep making it count." Back at his office that evening, Marcus sat by the window, the city skyline glowing against the twilight. He reflected on the journey, the obstacles, the lessons, the triumphs. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Dream big. This wasn't the end of the story, Marcus knew. The fight for equality, for respect, was ongoing. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, knowing that he had planted seeds of change that would grow long after he was gone. For Marcus Reed, success wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about lifting others along the way. And that, he realized, was the legacy he was destined to leave behind.